One can observe the interstellar spaceship Avalon sailing through space on its way to the Homestead 2 inhabited Earth. The ship is on autopilot, and every one of its compartments is vacant. Both the 5,000 passengers and the 258 crew members are dormant. The ship suddenly enters an asteroid belt, which weakens its shields. The main shield is given power, but the ship is headed straight for a massive asteroid. The ship suddenly collides with the asteroid, resulting in numerous problems. One of the sleep pods activates as the ship starts its own repairs. Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer, was the passenger who was awakened. He is helped to awaken by an automatic system, which informs him that he has been in suspended animation for 120 years and that Homestead 2 is only 4 months away from the ship. He is informed that he can use that time to take use of the sumptuous features of the ship. Before arriving on the planet, Jim is given instructions regarding his ID band, his cabin, and the main activities he is to participate in. He gets ready, exits his cabin, and enters an automated lesson intended for a large group of learners while feeling both anxious and excited to meet the other passengers. The hologram describes Earth's plight as being overpopulated, pricey, and overrated, while Jim shows signs of anxiety. Even though it instructs him to save his questions for the end of the course, Jim can't help but wonder why he's the only one present. He goes looking for other people after realizing that the hologram is unable to respond to him. He arrives at the ship's main concourse. Although there's no one present, an automated information desk gives assistance. Jim requested to speak with a live person, so he was directed to speak with a steward. However, he requested to speak with the captain when he noticed that nobody else was present. Even though he is unable to enter, he can see that none of the main crew members are awake as he arrives at the bridge. The ship is actually 90 years away from Homestead 2 when Jim finally visits the observatory. Since he doesn't sure how to go back into hibernation, he runs back to the concourse after realizing he got up too early and sends a message to Earth wondering what to do. His call to Earth would cost too much, and the communication system informs him that it would take 55 years to hear back. Jim is heartbroken. He makes his way to the ship's bar and discovers someone else there.
He appears odd to the bartender as they are conversing. Jim discovers that the man is an android when he tries to buy him a drink. It has the name Arthur. Jim wants to ask him more questions, but he is unable to even explain to the robot how it is possible for him to arrive early. The following morning, Jim wakes up in his cabin and heads to the cantina, where he immediately learns that the majority of the items on the menu are only available to gold-class travelers. He orders a simple cup of coffee and works to repair his hibernating chamber. He manages to get it running after he has all the necessary tools, and then he lies down inside the pod, but nothing takes place. He then makes the decision to enter the crew's hibernation chambers using the items he discovered. That also doesn't work. All across the ship, minor issues arise. Jim frequents the bar frequently to drink, but largely to chat with Arthur. He receives some counsel from the android, which persuades him to try breaking into one of the gold-class rooms and having some fun on the ship. Jim explores every eatery, game, and entertainment venue, but as time goes on, he grows more and more miserable about being there by himself. He once becomes inebriated and starts to wander around the sleep pods when he accidentally enters an airlock containing spacesuits intended for spacewalks. Jim dons a suit and heads to the airlock where he pulls a lever and then presses a button to open the door. He is enthralled by the scenery once he has left the ship. He is the only cognizant person there at that precise time. Jim, feeling crushed, releases the magnets from his boots and hovers in space. He returns inside, removes the suit, and then returns to the airlock without it. He pulls the lever, prepared to put an end to everything, but he suddenly changes his mind, dashes back inside, and trips over a bottle. Jim gets to his feet and is immediately drawn to Aurora, a woman who is in one of the pods. He listens to her passenger interview and looks through her files in the directory as he falls in love with her. It is then seen listening to her interviews while seated next to her pod. He is discussing her writing with Arthur while reading some of her work back at the bar.
He develops an obsession with the irony of his situation. He travels to another planet in search of a better life, wakes up early and doesn't make it there, and finds the ideal woman, only to discover that she is out of his reach. Jim can't stop thinking about her, and he starts to consider waking her awake as well. He discusses it with the android but is unable to resolve the paradox. He would be abandoning her there with him to perish on the ship if he awakened her for his own gain. Jim initially decides against it, but as time passes, he changes his mind. Until he decides otherwise, one day. He finds her pod and is able to turn it on. He hides and returns to his room when she awakens and goes through the same procedure that he did. Later, in an effort to locate her, he enters the main concourse. She is there, looking just as perplexed as he did a year ago. Jim brings her to the observatory and informs her that they are the only ones awake. Then he informs her that he is unable to reach either the crew or the ship's top commands. Aurora panics and tries to return to her pod. When they arrive, Jim informs her that they are trapped because there is no specialized equipment aboard the spacecraft that can assist them in returning to hibernation. They return to the concourse, where he advises her to rest, as she recently emerged from hibernation. She feels bad for him because he has to live alone on the ship for more than a year. Jim returns to the pub and feels bad about what he did. He asks Arthur to keep Aurora's awakening a secret from her. The next morning, Aurora awakens. She returns to the concourse and inquires about the hibernation pods at the automated information station. They go to eat breakfast when Jim joins her there. The information desk is experiencing some type of issue as they go. When Aurora notices that Jim has been eating the same breakfast for over a year in the cantina, she orders him something from the gold class menu. They discuss the prospect of fixing the pods, but Aurora, in contrast to Jim, isn't prepared to give up just yet. After looking through research materials and the hospital, she finally finds herself trying to break into the crew's hibernation rooms. Jim discovers more issues all across the ship. Aurora complains about her life on the Avalon later. She writes, runs around the ship, and swims in the pool as she grows increasingly conscious of her predicament. Jim's story would be fascinating, so she decides to interview him at the cantina. She queries his decision to move to the colony. Jim responds with company platitudes at first, then goes on to say that he believes the new environment would allow him to become someone and start a life. They eventually get at the observatory, when Aurora at last reveals her purpose for being there. She is one of the few people on the cruise with a round-trip ticket. Her plan was to travel to Homestead 2, settle there for a year, and then return to Earth, becoming the first journalist to do so and penning the greatest story in history in the process. Jim finds a method to make Aurora smile as she gradually gives up on finding a solution to their current problem. He brings her to the movies, the basketball court, and dancing. Then, he brings her to the bar so they may meet Arthur. She unwinds for a while before realizing their predicament. As he is left alone with the robot, Jim is filled with regret at what he has done to her. The other Aurora enters into the observatory and finds a miniature of the Chrysler building that he constructed for her shortly after he is next seen fiddling with something. They go out on a date to a bar later. They eat breakfast while exchanging life stories. She reveals to him that when she was a teenager, her father passed away. Jim leads Aurora to the airlock after dinner, where they don their spacesuits. They embark on a joint spacewalk. Jim may now finally tell someone about that wonderful event. They float in space together after Jim turns off the magnets on their boots. After returning inside, they share a passionate kiss before retiring to his cabin to spend the night. Soon later, they begin cohabitating. Aurora settles in his room and starts writing about her time spent at sea. Together, they go jogging, eat, and sleep. Jim continues to investigate the ship and discovers the hydroponics bay. He delivers aurora blooms. They go to the observatory to observe a red giant that the ship passes by one day. Later that evening, they celebrate Aurora's birthday in the bar and one of the ship's several restaurants. While Aurora stays in the bar talking to Arthur, Jim prepares the ring he made for her in the restroom. The android tells Aurora that Jim purposefully awakened her up, not realizing he was still supposed to keep it a secret. Jim reappears out of nowhere, and she confronts him in complete shock. She flees in anguish and fear. All of her belongings are gone when Jim returns to his cottage. The following day, he He runs into her in the cantina, but as soon as he starts talking, she bolts. Aurora needs help badly. She visits Jim's cabin one night while kicking and punching him and expressing her want to kill him. Jim tries to apologize and justify his behavior to her over the comm, because she keeps avoiding him. Aurora doesn't seem to mind when he tells her that he fell in love with her. He took her life, and she is unable to forgive him. One evening, while Jim is in his cabin, something else goes wrong. The primary command shuts down when the spacecraft experiences a critical error. Later, as he enters the elevator, it breaks down. Jim has planted a tree in the main concourse, which Aurora notices as she enters. She then makes her way to the cantina, where the food vending machine is similarly broken. Over the intercom, the deck chief's voice can be heard inquiring who planted the tree, startling them both. Gus Mancuso is seen in the concourse as Jim's tree, where the two of them have just entered. They introduce themselves and explain the issue to the chief. He cannot comprehend how 3 pods might malfunction. The information on the systems must be manually verified before Mancuso can determine what is wrong with the spacecraft as he leads them to the bridge. The two of them inform Mancuso that ship problems had been occurring increasingly regularly as they exit the bridge after a robot nearly hits them in the head. As he demonstrates how to gather the data, he asserts that shouldn't occur. Jim joins Mancuso as he checks on the pods. By the time Jim arrives, Mancuso has determined what happened to Aurora's pod. The deck chief thinks Jim's actions were bad. Later, when Aurora meets him at the bridge as he is reviewing the data acquired, they chat about what happened to her pod, but he informs her that there is nothing he can do. Jim enters carrying the 16th damaged robot. Mancuso rests after experiencing hibernation sickness, but as he leaves, he coughs up blood. Aurora goes swimming because she is unable to sleep that night. She begins to drown as the ship's gravity suddenly changes and the water from the pool flows along with her. She narrowly escapes alive once the gravity drive resets. As they search for Mancuso, they cross paths. Back at the bridge, the 3 of them are slowly learning what has been happening to the ship. Mancuso discovers that something occurred 2 years ago that destroyed a crucial system. The entire ship is attempting to take up the slack. Therefore, they need to identify and address the root of the problem. The whole ship will be stuck if they don't fix it. Mancuso passes out as they search for the issue, so Jim and Aurora take him to the hospital. He is dying, and there is nothing that can be done to stop it or give him more time. The 3 of them eventually cross paths at the observatory, where Mancuso hands Jim his ID bracelet, orders them to fix the ship, and then promptly dies. The ship shakes, and the lights suddenly turn an ominous crimson. They rush toward engineering when Jim tells Aurora he needs her assistance, but the gravity drive experiences yet another failure. And right away, another one that also affects Arthur. When they finally make it to engineering and begin looking for the issue, Jim deactivates him. When they open the hatch after finding it in the power plant, Aurora is sucked inside. There is a breach in the hull there due to the asteroid. Jim is also swept in, but he manages to hold on to the hatch as it keeps closing on him. He eventually falls in as well, but they are able to quickly close the gap. Jim discovers there are other breaches in the hull right away after resolving that issue. Following the trajectory of the 2 of them discover that it struck the reactor control computer. Jim believes he can locate spare parts for it. They locate the component and replace it, but the reactor's venting procedure is still unsuccessful. They attempt it manually, but fail once more. Jim realizes that in order to cool the reactor down, he must open the vent door from outside the ship. They both proceed to the airlock, and as he prepares to exit, he hands Aurora Mancuso's bracelet to her because he might not return. She assists him with the suit and tells him to return because she can't survive aboard the ship without him as he enters the airlock. Aurora returns to the reactor since the temperature there has reached dangerous levels. As Jim approaches the vent from the outside and notices the door, a bolt from the reactor shoots into her arm. While he tries to open the vent door without using it, the temperature in the reactor room rises. They dispute because she doesn't want him to pass away. She vents the reactor after he tells her they need to save the other people. Although the procedure is effective, Jim is pushed aside and his tether is broken by the reactor fumes. His suit's pressure is also decreasing. When Aurora is informed of what transpired, she reacts as quickly as she can to find another suit and bring the man inside. He offers her another apology. She dons a suit and flies out to meet him, but the length of her tether prevents her. Despite being pushed back, she manages to pull him in as she suddenly gets hold of his tether. Jim is already dead when Aurora drags him into the medical facility. Mancuso is revived by her using his wristband to circumvent medical protocol. Jim is revived by the medical pod, which completes the task automatically, and Aurora pardons him. Later, Aurora fixes Arthur, and Mancuso is properly buried in space. Jim brings her to the hospital and informs her that he has figured out how to convert the medical pod into a hibernation pod. She is instructed to enter the pod and continue the adventure there, according to him. She declines, though, and chooses to remain awake on board the ship with him, as is eventually made clear. Finally, Jim asks her to marry him, and they continue to live on the ship. The Avalon arrives at Homestead 2, 88 years later. When the crew awakens, they discover the ship in an unforeseen condition. While the others were resting, Aurora sends them a message in which she recounts the life she and Jim led on the ship. Please subscribe and enable notifications so you can view more content like to this. I appreciate you watching.